Kia ora tātou. I do have connections to the space as well as people, and when I come here, one of the things I remember first is the start of our third year as student teachers, which is the first year of the third years for the Diploma of Teaching of Early Childhood in 1992. And one of the things that I remember that we did, because we were asked to provide a presentation, working groups, and provide a presentation that spoke to what we expected from the final year. Sorry, I'm standing in the light. And one of the things that we wanted to do was to put a challenge to our lecturers about what we expected in relation to the things that we'd felt as guinea pigs for year one and year two might happen a bit better in relation to our voice as students. Having said that, what I remember of being a student here is all good. I don't know that my lecturers remember me as being all good, but it filled me up with a sense of wanting to be committed and sticking at being an early childhood teacher, and then moving into lecturing in early childhood education and researching early childhood. That was sustained from being here, and sustained through, I guess, what I'm trying to say is I acknowledge my lecturers, and I acknowledge this space for keeping me focused. Having said that, it's taken me a long time to get to some of the points that I'm about to talk about today. And so there's been a lot of, I would say, slowness in realising certain things or approaching certain issues, perhaps partly because of what happens when you get caught up in the day-to-day of your work as a teacher, or then your work as, for me, an external marker for New Zealand Tertiary College, which I still remember when I was invited to be an external marker, and I said, I don't really fancy that, I'm quite happy working in the centre. And then I was told how much I was going to make, and as I was also studying my Masters, I jumped at the chance. And so there's another issue going on there for me in terms of my own personal journey of what it was that discriminated between what I was doing as a teacher and what I was doing as an external marker. I mean, I hope I was good as an external marker, but I had no relationship to the students. And it wasn't until I started working at the tertiary college in a lecturing role that I started to take more seriously what that might mean, what assessment meant, how assessment impacted on students. I'm now at AUT, and at a point in time, I was encouraged to think about going for a promotion from lecturer to associate professor, and I'm still wondering whether or not that was a bad idea, in part because I don't think I was ready for that. I don't think I was well cooked. You might be the judge of that by looking at the work I'm doing here today, although the work isn't just mine. The work's everyone's. So, yeah, please be the judge of that. That's kind of a funny way to introduce yourself. It's like saying, I'm about to cook you a really bad meal. Yeah. But, who is it? There's a fairly famous chef who was quite clear that you don't insult your guests ever by saying that I apologise for what you're about to eat. So I've just ruined that first rule. In the Education Council's 5 papers on leadership, of which I'm going to refer briefly to 2, Mason Jury starts with this whakatauki, e hara taku toa I te toa takitahi, engari I te toa takitini, which is variously translated in relation to the leadership and the importance of understanding as a leader that you're leading as a group. And so that all of our work is never just our own work. And that to me is an important whakatauki here because of an acknowledgement of, actually I'm going to jump one, that this seminar builds on ongoing and amplifying concerns that I've been introduced to sometimes or been aware of through my own experiences, and certainly heard more and more through discussion with graduates of the program at AUT, graduates of the program at New Zealand Tertiary College, and then my colleagues in the sector. Sorry, I was just wondering if something was wrong. All right, so the first thing to do is to acknowledge that there's a lot of work being done in this area, and I'm trying to pull it together. I'm not the expert on this, and my purpose here is to explore the debates, to consider some implications, particularly in relation to the Education Council's very clear mandate to improve the status of the teaching profession, and to see what the role is for myself and for other people in teacher education for sustaining systems of support when we look at the professional status of early childhood teaching, and also the working conditions that closely relate to that. So, I started pulling together what I hoped would be a very brief set of bullet points that would then open up to discussion, but the more I looked, the more I realised there were a lot of bullets. So the discussion, I hope, will go on after this session, and I haven't timed it, so I'm not quite sure how it's going to go, but as you'll see, there is a lot of information, there's a lot of research, and it's come out of New Zealand and Australia and around the world that explores the status of the profession and that engages critically with working conditions of teachers. As I said in the acknowledgements, this is not just about what I've found through conducting a literature review. It's all about the stories of our graduates and the stories of the teachers who we work with as associate teachers. It's also about the stories of our graduates that aren't currently working in the early childhood sector, because after their graduation, they've gone to do other things for reasons that might be related to their employment conditions. We're going to look at the week of Kirsty Johnston's Herald articles as a start point for this, some of which were very focused on primary and secondary school, and others early childhood, but they all have implications for the status of the profession. And analysing the status of the profession for secondary and primary, and I think higher education teachers, lecturers, makes a difference for the ways in which we're going to discuss the experiences of early childhood teachers in their work. After looking at those, well, just a summary of some of the key points, I'm going to look at the research in Aotearoa and Australia with a particular focus on basically the last 15 years of relevant research that's come out of looking at the early childhood teaching profession in New Zealand. I'm going to introduce how the concept of emotional labour then talks to some of the things that the researchers found. Then looking at one of the key tensions in early childhood education, and it comes out in some of the research, is this idea of what it means for a sector to be focused on itself as a business. So how does the notion of business and how might different ideas of business impact on the way in which we think about working conditions for teachers in early childhood. And then looking at the role of teacher education. And teacher education is a business too. Right, but first, okay, a preface. Kirsty puts together excellent investigative week-long series of articles. So in 2015 there was a week that I had to return to think what happened last year and what have I done since then in relation to responding to the key concerns that she raised in her Herald articles. So it's important to kind of preface what happened in her series 2 weeks ago with what was being talked about in 2015. That there were sector-wide concerns about quality in early childhood education, that caring and teaching, that learning conditions and that management were all poor. And one of the enduring experiences for me at that time was the use of anonymous teachers. So acknowledging that teachers didn't feel comfortable having a public voice in relation to what they were saying about their experiences in early childhood centres. So my concern immediately is there's an issue with the status of the profession, and there's an issue with the voice of teachers if teachers are concerned to be anonymous when they're talking to the press. 1 year on. Okay, so 5 a.m. Monday, May the 2nd, 2016. We read that the arts are suffering at the hands of the STEM subjects. This is interesting because I think that there's a tendency to criticise the STEM subjects as if the STEM subjects are really happy with their economically driven focus. But I don't think that's the case. I think mathematicians love not necessarily thinking about themselves as being the oil that greases the economic machine, and that mathematicians are intensely creative and aren't particularly worried, might be particularly worried about the ways in which maths then becomes privileged over other subjects. So critiquing the STEM subjects is not necessarily productive when we're looking at what actually drives the notion of what counts as an academic subject. We also learnt that educational leaders have been resistant to the implementation of standards-based approaches in primary schools. So primary schools aren't happy in general with standards. One principal said, good educators are people who understand how humans grow. It's not a linear one-size-fits-all thing, and an intelligent education system should be able to recognise that complexity. Right, so what we're looking for here is an intelligent system. Teachers are not to be trusted, however, although this didn't come from the same principle, when it comes to testing. Right, so the statement was that teachers are in danger of making their own judgments when it comes to testing. So there's an issue around this whole idea of a professional voice, an ability to discriminate between a teacher making a kind of soft assessment and a test which provides kind of hard evidence. And again, this was focused on primary schools. Having criticised the possibility that measuring isn't what it's all about, the article also suggests, or people interviewed in the article suggest that the metaphor of progress is so important to us that we need to know that we're going somewhere. So we need testing to provide evidence of that. And the union commented that all of this needs to be taken into consideration within the context of there's a lack of secure jobs, that teachers are struggling with their experiences in teaching and learning around cultural competency, and that the huge impact of poverty impacts on all of this. Now, it's quite clear in terms of a lot of the policies that have come out in the last 10 years that poverty is a target in terms of discriminating which groups teachers need to be better prepared to work with. Right, Tuesday morning. All right, hold on, let's go back to the arts are suffering. Achievement in reading, writing and maths is a concern. Right, so we've got the curriculums fairly covered in terms of it being a concern. Primary teachers are talking to the Herald saying developmental play and rich language are more valuable than sitting on the mat and sitting up straight in primary schools for the learning of reading, writing and math. Stuart McNaughton enters into the debate talking about the ways in which we have no real idea of whether or not we're getting value for money from the funding for early childhood education. So there's a huge investment in early childhood, but we don't know whether we're getting good value. And he questions the ethics of the regime for funding, because not so much that the money's going out, but there's not effective systems to measure if it's being spent effectively. So we don't know as much as we should know around whether the money is being realised in terms of quality education programs. Stuart didn't say this. I can't remember quite who. I think it was another primary teacher. Testing of children will not lead to better outcomes, was a key point made. And in relation to that, school-like lessons have a negative impact on learning dispositions. So primary teachers were talking about in primary schools that the engagement of children, particularly through years 1 to 4, their engagement with reading, writing and maths was suffering from their experiences of school-like lessons. Wednesday. Students who do well, this is secondary school students, who do well in their exams at school do not typically choose teaching as a career. The university deans find this a problem and want the pick of the secondary crop. The best and the brightest is the language that the university deans have used. So they've got a concern around the status of the profession in the sense of if the status can be improved, perhaps we'll get the pick of the crop, or perhaps they've got if we can get the pick of the crop, the status will be improved. Roger Molson said that this is a complex issue, and saying it's complex, we shouldn't hide behind that and say, well, we can't really solve this. So here are all these factors, here are all these complications and contradictions and paradoxes. We can't hide behind that. At times when we talk about issues around working conditions, you can be accused of being an alarmist. And normally getting called an alarmist is something, you're told that because you're told you don't really have anything to say, or that people don't want to listen to what you have to say. So the question is, once we've started talking about people as alarmists, do we then forget about the complexity of the issue? Student achievement and professional status are linked. The status of the profession and the quality of mentoring and support for teachers is linked. And as I've said already, the Education Council's prime directive is raising the status of the profession. So based on this research and based on the information from Kirsty's article, we've got to start looking at the quality of mentoring and support for teachers if we're going to raise the status of the profession. And we've also got to look at student achievement. Now, in early childhood education, there's a wide variety of perspectives on what student achievement might look like. Thursday. Evidence of achievement indicates that as a nation we have mainly been getting worse in teaching and learning, math, and need to build an army of specialist teachers. So we were introduced on Thursday with another look at specifically math now, and that generalist teachers aren't well suited to teaching math and that we need specialist teachers. Also, that through NCEA we've resulted in students opting out of math and also science, and this is a problem, so we need to go back to a set of core subjects and remove those opt-out possibilities. In terms of math achievement and in terms of teaching and learning, the problem years appear to be between years 4 and 8. So interestingly enough, years 1 to 4, which are regarded as the years where learning through play in primary school, although I'm not quite sure how many primary teachers use learning through play with their math. But from years 4 to 8 are the years where math learning gets turned off, according to the research. Also that there's a disconnect between, again, this notion of cultural competence and learning maths. So teachers who have a stronger awareness and a stronger familiarity with the funds of knowledge based on the social and cultural backgrounds of the students appear to be better able to support their students achieve in maths. So the funds of knowledge research coming out of Arizona would see that as no surprise. And I think it's nice to read that children can actually be excited about learning math. There's probably not many early childhood teachers that don't know that. Right, the final is actually dated on Thursday, but this was the Friday instalment for the week. So the final article looks at the question of the different priorities for teachers to understand in terms of their abilities to support learners. Again, there's a look at cultural competency in terms of how teachers work with children from disadvantaged backgrounds. There's a look at reading and writing, and interestingly, a third of Year 1 and Year 2 teachers had minimal understanding of effective reading and writing, but also had minimal understanding that something needed to change in relation to that. So they weren't aware that they had no understanding or minimal understanding and thought everything was going fine. Awareness of the issue has not led to change. So again, the idea of the intelligent system might be key here. The system doesn't seem to be able to work with awareness of issues. Productive new approaches to working with children in terms of their reading and writing and their language development in general have seen a shift to phonics. And it's hoped that over time, this will greatly improve the experiences of the young learner. I can already see that some people are quite ready to jump into that debate. In the paper, the reading and phonics programs were seen as programs that would be best run together rather than separated out. So it's not one or the other. And health services have started to get on to the task of supporting children in their language development. So seeing their role as looking at wellbeing holistically when working with the health and wellbeing of whānau. Teachers need more opportunity to collaborate in the development of pedagogies for language learning. I thought this was a really critical provocation to end the week. It's like, how is it that teachers are working together, taking the time to collaborate around what they see as being their learning outcomes and their pedagogical techniques and the ways in which they deal with, for instance, notions of cultural competence. So we end with this idea of, whereas the focus in math was very much on specialism, one of the focuses in language is collaboration, which is not to suggest that the role of the specialist might not be to support all teachers in the way in which they understand what content in math and how to teach it. What do you call that? PCK. Right. Some provocations from related research. How are we going? Okay. In 2000, a review of the literature on human resource issues in education, and you might have seen Full and Maskell cited in a number of different places over the years, because it's quite a challenging piece of work that puts to teachers that they are human capital. In the knowledge society, in a society that constantly generates new ideas and problems to be solved requiring intellectual, financial and social resources, we need a teaching and principle force capable of learning on a continuous basis. So here you see the rhetoric of lifelong learning without calling it lifelong learning. There's a considerable evidence that individuals and organisations that continually access and process knowledge in terms of designated goals and indicators of performance are successful. What you're also seeing here is a shift towards a different way of thinking about business, right? One that's a challenge for the sector when the business of publishing very much limits access to knowledge. So the paywalls that university academics are encouraged to publish behind create problems with this idea of the knowledge society. They went on to argue that we need, and I think these are again, in a sense, no-brainers, more collaborative and transparent working conditions. I guess the thing that is surprising is that it's coming out of literature on human capital theory, which is often used to construct this idea of the worker as a cog in a machine. And also that for teachers to be active members in a knowledge society, they need to be engaged publicly with debates about the teaching profession. Right? So no more anonymous, or no more fear of what leads to anonymity. Because I'm certainly not criticising a teacher for wanting to be anonymous. but it's the conditions in which we might feel that we have to be. Well, when I say we, as an associate professor, I'm required to say a lot, and yeah, who knows what that's about. In 2003, a report to government on the teaching profession in Aotearoa. This is from Murray Cameron. Globally recognised concerns around working conditions. So in 2003, there was a strong report to the government saying there are issues with working conditions, that there's a link between the status of the profession and its gendered nature, that the status of the profession is symptomatic of the status of the child. So if you look at the status of the profession and then you compare the different statuses, then you see the ways in which the child in which the teacher works with has a similar declining status, which is interesting considering all of the effort to impress upon governments of the critical period of the first 5 years. There's a missing link in the system, in part caused by a bums on seats policy in higher education. So this was also reported in 2003 that the higher education was so focused on getting as many students in the door that they were missing how that impacts on the development of the profession. Which is an interesting challenge in the sense of the way in which that starts to gatekeep and who might be missed out in relation to being excellent members of the profession, and who might have been disregarded because of the ways in which you then start thinking about the opposite of bums on seats. Cameron provided indicators of what might a shift look like. So we need more applicants than positions in higher education. That the sector is more involved in the approval of programs so that teachers have much more of a say in what a teacher education program should look like. More public discussion about teaching is led by teachers, and that's a reiteration of Phelan and Maskell's point. That people change careers to take up teaching. That accountability is fair and transparent. The community take a collective responsibility for the well-being of its teachers. And pay, and this is the first time we've talked about it, pay and working condition parity with comparable professions. Right, jump 5 years, Ruth Kane puts out a report on the experiences of early childhood teachers. This is a disaggregated set of data from a larger look at the teaching profession. And so when they took out the data that was specifically focused on the views of people who work in the early childhood sector, she had 15 teachers, 5 head teachers, and 4 committee members. And in that research, she found that people in the sector realised the critical societal role they play. They also realised that the amount of work they did in upholding that critical role wasn't commensurate with the resourcing they provided. They were provided by the government. They were aware that the status of the profession requires a nationwide campaign, raising awareness and encouraging support of the public. Pathways to the Future was regarded as symbolic of a growth in respect for teachers, and Linda Mitchell looked at this as well, looking at how there was something about Pathways to the Future that had a kind of democratising effect on the sector. Teachers remain in the profession due to perceived rewards that are intrinsic, altruistic and collegial. So whilst the talk about working conditions on one hand looks at issues around pay, then the views of teachers might be that it's not about the pay, and that I'm not leaving because of the intrinsic reward of being in this profession. Kind of similar to what Maltzin argued about, but Kane is now saying, as a critique and a provocation to the sector, and in particular to teacher education providers, do not disguise the complexity and challenges that early childhood teachers face daily. And because I've probably over-planned and have way too much stuff, I'll just jump to a point that I make at the end. That 20 years ago, universities spent very little time advertising themselves. Their marketing teams have got bigger and bigger, and the branding's got bigger and bigger, and the billboards are everywhere. And we know that universities are for the changing world, or the real world, or real world learning, or now Auckland is just this kind of weird A with a little bit hanging off it, but world ranked. Okay. Marketers don't spend much time providing a truthful, real glimpse when they say, come and get a degree in early childhood teaching. And probably would be unlikely to be receptive to the lecturer saying, well, you know, there's not just the pretty pictures, there's also other pictures. Kane's research indicated some solutions to the issues around the status of the profession and the working conditions in particular. Pay parity, increased collaboration between unions, teacher education providers and teachers. Inviting early childhood teachers to talk about what the wider community, including secondary school students contemplating career choices, cannot ensure. So the core reasons and intrinsic satisfaction gained from working in a dynamic, collegial, demanding, but rewarding career. So it's just, there's a slight tension with tell it like it is. Be open about the variable working hours and holidays and acknowledge that they are more generous for some than what is available in other professions. More generous. I remember Peter Roberts did some research on how many hours an academic worked, looking at his colleagues at the University of Auckland, and it was between 70 and 80 hours a week. So, I mean, maybe you get longer holidays. You could call that time in lieu. And he did this before PPRF, so before the publish or perish paradigm. In 2011, a report by Podmore and Wells on induction and mentoring indicated that beginning teachers received valuable support. Variable.
Quite a different point.
It is quite different. I think I need my glasses. Thank you for reading. Mentoring should be educationally focused. So in recent publications, the NZCER have talked increasingly about mentoring not being focused on being the friend who brings you into the sector, but continues to drive your pedagogical thinking. It's pedagogical leadership. It turned into the focus on the mentoring relationship. And importantly, that mentoring collaborations shouldn't be sucked into these atomised centres. That collaboration has a significant impact on the mentoring experience. One way to think about that would be to think about what role might teacher education have over those beginning years in relation to supporting the mentor-mentee relationship, which might then also feed back into the quality of the programs that are being taught. I'm starting to jump ahead a little bit because blah blah. Yes, all right. 2013, from the University of Auckland. I love this one. Graduating teachers are vulnerable to the formation of false beliefs. Any such beliefs influence teaching and learning. For this reason, it's important that graduating teachers habitually recognise that the beliefs they currently hold may turn out to be untrue. And I think that might be a provocation for the status of my teaching, how I'm regarded by the public. What I believe to be the case about that might turn out to be untrue. The Education Review Office published guidelines which provide some guiding questions relevant to working conditions. In particular, what kind of distributed leadership models are centres and leaders using? What's the experience of collaboration and collegiality? How are partnerships with the community supported? What professional learning do leaders undertake, so their own professional learning, and how is a trusting environment established? Now these are things that the ERO should be going into, that says that it's going to go into the centre and have a look at. However, in the report on management experiences in 2014, the focus was very much on recruitment policies and employment responsibilities around induction. So these ideas of collaboration kind of get lost in terms of what was researched and presented as the data on employment conditions. What they did find is that poor employer practices normally came out in the form of poor self-review practices and poor leadership practices. They also found that umbrella organisations seemed better able to support those self-review and leadership practices. They were concerned that appraisal seemed to be a one-off rather than a sustained activity. And the review addresses how complaints about staff are made, but not how staff complain about their employers. So there's this huge gap in the way they're thinking about the complaints process. It's all about making sure that when a parent has a concern about one of your teachers, you know exactly what to do. But what happens when the parent has the complaint about you? Or what happens when one of your teachers has a complaint about you? So the ERO haven't addressed that. Education Counts, just as a final bit of data on employment conditions and the professional status, see turnover as being one of the critical things that will determine the quality of a centre. Interestingly, the aggregated early childhood sector's turnover is 19%, and nationwide the level is about 16%. So they don't particularly see that as there being a turnover issue in the country. What they do recognise is that when there's a high turnover in a centre of teachers, that has a significant impact on the curriculum. Yes. Higher turnover can be related to the growth in the sector. So at times when the sector's booming, that can lead to higher turnover. Lower turnover can be related to the change in incentives for staffing. So when the incentives went from the ceiling went from 100 back to 80, people were less likely to move. Right, the New Zealand Initiative think tank regarding teacher quality, which is an independent lobby group. Teachers' pay should be performance-based, according to measurable standards. Teachers are human capital and as such are attracted to the best performing systems. Initial teacher education is too theoretical, and initial teacher education providers should be ranked according to the employment outcomes of their graduates. So we should have public statistics for each university and private provider that says this is where the graduates go. We might have to forget about Australia. Sorry, Australia. But it's really important to acknowledge that in Australia the situation is quite different because of the ongoing tension between the notion of the carer and the teacher. And the teaching qualifications are for 0 to 8. What the researchers around the professional status of teachers are looking at is the way in which that creates a lot of tension between those people that identify as carers unqualified and those that identify as teachers qualified. And that those few people that work in a 0 to 5 setting, work with children under the age of 5, they're the minority. So most people that get a degree that qualifies them to teach 0 to 8 will work in a primary school. Emotional labour. Right, so emotional labour we bring to bear on this because of the connection between a lot of these factors around status and what it is that is exploited in the teacher's profession, in her work with children. Sorry, I've gotten rid of the word curriculum, thank you. Caring for the child is associated with a resistance to normalising the child. Lillian Katz wrote about this in 1971. So she's looking at the way in which positively the profession was looked at as a caring profession because of the ways in which teachers then were advocates for children in relation to certain normalising tendencies. So teachers were resistant back in the 70s, as Katz has observed. They were resistant to the ideas that the children would be tested according to norms and standards. Staff are sensitive to their roles with children and whānau and understand how resistance might impact on the centre community. So the status of the profession and the concept of emotional labour helps us to understand that teachers are highly concerned about the well-being of the centre and so less likely to raise complaints. This then leads to more likelihood of exploitation. Early childhood, according to Yarrow Andrews' research, early childhood teachers are likely to be compliant in the face of poor working conditions. That where resistance occurs, it's highly localised rather than mobilised. That job security impacts on resistance. So it's hard to resistance when there's high turnover. It's hard to resist when you can be quite effectively marginalised. Sarah Farquhar found a very similar finding as this: teachers are resistant to sending their own children to an early childhood setting. When you look at the tendency for homeschooling, it's amazing how many homeschoolers are teachers. Well, maybe it's not amazing, but it certainly says something about the intelligent system that we're in. There's scant attention to the well-being of teachers and how that well-being impacts on the curriculum and children. Teacher mental health has a significant impact on children. So there's not attention to the ways in which mental health is being supported. Having said that, emotional labour isn't something that just comes up as a negative theorisation of the exploitation of teachers. That there's a strong resistance seeing emotional labour as something that when you're in control of your emotional labour, you have emotional capital. And then you can, as a group, collectively, use your emotions to impact positively on your working conditions. All right. Shall I keep going? Right. When we talk about business, and Sue Stover put this idea in my head, like when we were talking about these issues, and she said, "Whose business is it?" And you know, business is a word that's often been a cause of tension within the sector because of its association with for-profit versus not-for-profit. But I think we've got to think about the different ways in which we can understand business. So competitive business models discourage the sharing of knowledge and don't work with the idea of the knowledge society. So this is where centres become isolated and don't want their teachers to share ideas. Right, so that's a particular business model. Right? Privatisation is the most significant cause for concern in education according to the Education International. So we've got to understand that, I think, it's public models are running to business, certain particular kinds of business models. So it's dangerous to start thinking there's an either or here. Josh Jesson and Richard Smith talk about education systems being managed like machines. Well, that's a particular kind of business that's run like a machine. And if you look at, although it's slightly rhetorical, but some of the new tech industries don't talk about running their workers like machines. And it talk very much about the participatory democratic approach to running a business. The old busnocratic business models look at surveillance and regulation. So this is very much about like, we get to quality, we get a quality output in terms of our service for children if we increase our surveillance and regulation rather than our support. One element of that which has occurred to us recently is also increasing our behaviour management. So the human capital theorists and the post-Fordists look at the ways in which you, as a business owner, manage the behaviour of your staff in order to get the best out of them? Well, behaviour management is something that's kind of been revived in early childhood education through the government's interest in the Incredible Years teacher. Right, so it's a paradigm of how is it that we can manipulate people's behaviour and to get the best out of our teaching and learning. It might suggest there's a synergy between how teachers experience being led and how teachers experience their working conditions and what's expected of teachers in terms of their professional development. Learn how to manage children's behaviour. Helen May talked about politics in the playground in a way that suggested that economics was about politics, but it might not be about politics, it might be about policing. So Jacques Rancière talks about the difference between politics and police as the difference between marginalising and not allowing voices and allowing voices. And he talks about politics as a kind of flighty thing that we don't experience in a sustained way, and that the notion of police is, in a sense, a grounding for society because it establishes norms and values. But that politics is also critical because it's where groups realise that they can have a say. And business is becoming more about encouraging employees to have a say. This is the theorisation around good business. This is coming out of the literature around, for instance, social innovation and collective intelligence. That innovation for businesses occurs through the giving of a voice to teachers. Jane Gilbert's work recognises this and says that no intelligent system is going to work well if the systemic change doesn't come from within. So good business occurs when systemic change comes from within. This means, and my colleague Janita was at Whaia Rose Pere's session a couple of weeks back, and in a kind of rough paraphrasing of that, don't be programmed by the state, was Whaia Rose's provocation to teachers. This means collaborating. So this means setting up and experiencing networks and not considering collaboration to be something that impacts on your business. Well, impacts negatively on your business. All right. Implications for teacher education, and we're almost there. Sue Charrington's work on reflection, I think, is an important provocation for teacher education. It looks at the ways in which reflection occurs as a group experience. And it connects back to the whakatauki that I started with. So, how is teacher education like? How can we approach a lot of the individualising aspects of teacher education? And those are aspects that are put upon teacher education by higher education systems. How can we engage in teacher education that supports the mentor-mentee relationships? How can we make sure that professional development is accessible in terms of time and money? And this means avoiding the kind of research culture that says, oh, we'll only go and work with centres if we're getting paid to. So this is, we need research funding. But as members of academics and public institutions, we're already paid to research. So when an academic or a researcher says to you, well, I'll have to get funding, you can point out to them they're already funded. How do we engage in ongoing dialogue with the sector about working conditions that sustains and amplifies voices? And what is it about pathways to the future that might help that? If there is something that's intensely democratising about pathways to the future, then we need to kind of draw that essence out. Mobilising students as an experience of study in higher education. So this kind of returns me back to this whole idea that as students we were asked to critique our teacher education provider. So that experience has to be in there. And then again, like I said, revealing the different stories that hide behind the branding. Imagine if we started looking more critically at the profession and the working conditions in a holistic sense. Not because we want to scare people off, but because we think about this experience as being one about openness and honesty. And then where to go from here. Not worrying about alarmism, but saying, having noticed these things, what do we do as a group? Well, there's some questions which I'm probably not going to get to, and a whole lot of references, and I'm happy to send the PowerPoint and whatever else comes out of that. Huh? Oh, and it's recorded.
thank you. You've managed to pour a whole lot of information, knowledge into a very short time. It's quite incredible, the range of material that you've pulled together for us, and I'm staggering under the weight and wondering where to start. I think what's overwhelmingly left, perhaps for all of us, is the notion of collaboration, trust and discussion and talking. And rather than me actually try to encapsulate everything that Andrew said, which I couldn't possibly do justice to, what about taking some comments from you guys? Just a couple, I think, and then probably we can continue the conversation over, is there a wine?
Yep.
There is a wine, over an A block. So maybe a couple of, yeah, we're just actually figuring out that there is snacks.
Can I just say, I'm really keen on, I apologise for leaving so little time,
Yeah.
but I'm really keen on any ways in which this doesn't end here. For those people that are keen to talk through, particularly the teachers that are here.
Yes,
I have a
could be
question
here.
rather
Yeah.
than a comment. Can you just tell me who the author was or what the research was that you referred to coming out of Arizona on funds of knowledge?
Oh, okay. Yes. Gonzalez and her team. Yeah. Mole. And Helen Hedges
From here.
speaks to it as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
The funds of knowledge research looks at us in Arizona. It's a very different kind of context without the whāriki. Although having said that, funds of knowledge literature can help us look at those principles and strands within the whāriki that require us to understand what partnership means.
Cool.
Yeah.
A couple more comments. Yes,
I think it's quite interesting because you presented this from sort of 2008 or sort of but earlier, and I've been in the profession for a really long time and had the opportunity to work overseas as well. And what I see is, we talk very strongly about collaboration and relationships, but in a way it's that tension of how do you take those intangible aspirations, a bit like dispositions, what does that look like in behaviour, and fit it in the diversity of models that are now available in New Zealand and have access to this funding. And I think this is such a complex area now because it's been allowed to, as was pointed in your research, how do we measure this quality? And all of us now have a kind of anonymous disquiet. I'll speak for myself. A kind of very disturbing disquiet in my heart on how do you deliver that open, trusting collaboration, and a bit like dispositions. What does that behaviour look like? Well, it looks like happy children and happy families and outcomes, but we don't have that now, and particularly when we have these incredible diversity of private providers, like what is it we're really trying to achieve here? And I think, it's almost the baby's gone out with the bathwater now. Like, people are really worried in some areas about how between SEE hours is being spent. Even the Educational Council came out, I think, last year and spoke strongly about how this money could be tagged to families. And then, so in each case, whatever we've got strong kind of research that supports that, like, oh well, my 19-year-old German nanny gets my 20 SEE hours because that runs all year. And that's okay because that's supporting parents' choice. So in a way, it's almost for me like we do know what works. We had a wonderful wheel that was circular. Now why don't we just take the corners off it and see how it runs again? Because now it's exhausting trying to deal with the amount of research, and like you said, it's a user-pays system, and even in universities you've gone through such a shift on what research is and why you should be performing it to how research was conducted in universities 20 years ago. think there's some really good questions.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, I've been reminded regularly in terms of this, working here on this, and also another thing I'm doing, not to be chucking any stones in the glass house of higher education. And that we are set up within the public institutions to support collaboration. If the centres of innovation worked, then how can we keep those things working, for instance, without having to, why were they not maintained? I mean, this is what the minister might ask: is, well, if you really like them, why aren't you still doing them?
Perhaps they assumed a culture of collaboration already. If all that money was poured into them for all of those years, then surely they're such great examples that we've all learned from them. I mean,
yes. I mean, the minister was talking to teachers on the issue of the withdrawing of funding for Te Kotahitanga and the complaints about the withdrawing of funding because it's such a good program. And her answer was, which wasn't received well, but there's merit to the answer, was, if it's so good, why aren't you doing it? Why do you need the extra funding to do it?
So that would be the same argument that happened when the government was providing professional development to centres regardless, so that now you can only get onto those schemes that meet criteria under a targeted framework. So that means there's not that collaboration, because you can have a centre that's hypothetically making a lot more money in a targeted area, profiting, but you might be a centre that's deemed as not meeting that target and then you're isolated. So it's causing disquiet.
In terms of where to go in the disquiet, part of it is not letting a week-long series of critiques sit and maintaining that voice and maintaining the discussion about them. Part of it is establishing the networks that support the sector to have these conversations regularly, and that's where I really invite people to get in touch and to keep in touch, and to do so in a way that suggests what is it that the universities can do for us. Because I think if the communities aren't asking for the universities to do what they want, then what's the purpose of the universities? I mean, some people will argue the purpose of the universities is to make a society look like it's advanced. But there might be other ways to understand what a university is about. And arguments about teacher education aside, there's the research that supports centres.
Can we take a final comment before we move over? So,
Andrew, what do you see as the biggest barriers to the kind of initiatives around partnerships between compulsory sector, primary and local early childhood centres? Sort of a big wish list under the sort of rebranding of 0 to 6 as early learning, Nancy Bell as the new director, all those sorts of initiatives that have some element opening space for some sort of more blurry border between the primary and the centre. What do you see as the biggest barriers there?
The biggest barrier to...
Maybe the biggest is the wrong word, but...
You mean to connection between the early childhood and the primary?
Under your encouragement around collaboration.
Yeah.
So the sense of collaboration.
What's the biggest barrier? Can I say early childhood teacher working conditions?
Yeah, being able to use the corny phrase off the floor.
Yeah, I think that there are so many ways in which that impacts on the scope, capacity, and the nature of those experiences of what kinds of discussions you might have.
You did promise to ask how many teachers were in this audience and whether any of them had felt bullied or unable to bring complaints up in their workplaces. Could we do that?
Yep. Sure. So the question is, thank you.
How many teachers who aren't in management are here now?
now or
At any time.
Right, so that's a key barrier. And so the intelligence of the system would then be a barrier as well in terms of how it is that teachers have a voice around those experiences. So better complaints procedures might be one. There is a very interesting graphic on the, was it the ERO?
Yeah, the ERO complaints.
Their ERO complaints process. If you can find that online, it does tell you where all ERO complaints go to. It's worth, yeah.
Do you think getting more technology into the classrooms can have a positive impact on the results of children?
Depends on what you define by more technology. I mean,
Well, like centrally organized educational programs instead of everybody having to teach the same thing over and over.
in early childhood education, I'd have to think about that. I mean, to me, it would be kind of like, I mean, a colleague of mine is currently researching how dance is done, right? So a central system for dance might be like, what's that product? Jump Jam? Right? Wiggle Jam or? Jump, okay. For her, this is the same as like everyone having the same colouring in or cookie cutter approach to the visual arts.
Behaviour management, what you're talking about, the expected years teacher.
Yeah. Or yes. Yeah.
Curriculum right there.
So I think there'd be some issues around the centralisation. I mean, I think networks can work really well at disrupting rather than centralising. There probably are ways in which there's elements of one's role that a good intelligent system.
For the teacher to teach the children in need, the things that are the same every year can be done by video.
Yeah, which kind of, but implies that the children that are come with a context that the system can cope with. How intelligent is the program that it can? I mean, if we look at mathletics, for instance, which is like booming in primary schools, mathletics creates kind of a narrow understanding of what maths might be. But because it's using game theory effectively and behaviour management theory, it's fairly popular, although I don't know if there's been any research on how children resist mathletics.